Welcome back. It's now August 7th, so we're most of the way through the summer. We've been tracing what's happening with COVID-19 primarily in New Jersey, but we've expanded our look to the other states around the country, and we've been looking a little bit at the country at large. Okay, there's slightly bad news in New Jersey. Our number of infections seem to be growing slowly. The good news in New Jersey, though, is that the number of hospitalizations and our use of the ICU is dropping. Now, there's bad news in much of the south of the country. Their infection rates are very high, but there's good news in that all of them seem to have a lowering of infection rates. So let's look at the um, uh, or the COVID Act Now website, where they have a nice map that we can look at. Okay, so every state is ranked on 5 criteria. Let me just go down to what those are. The daily cases per 100,000. So that's basically how many people are testing positive each day, but it's adjusted per 100,000 people of your population. Um, then there's the infection rate. So that's how quickly the number of infections is growing. And the positive test rate. If you have a low positive test rate, that's good because it means you must have a large pool of people being tested if a small percentage of them are showing up as being positive. And then the ICU headroom. This shows you how many people are seriously sick. You want that number to be low. That you want, it shows that if it's 0%, all of your ICU is available for sick people to come in. If you're at 100%, you have no more room for sick people. And contacts traced down here at the bottom. That means when somebody shows up positive within 48 hours, the contact tracers will be able to reach everyone who they should, who was around the positive case, so that they can also get tested and possibly quarantine to stop the spread of the virus. So when we look at the map as a whole, we can see there's only one green case. This COVID Act Now is being conservative about calling states green. Green is good, by the way. Um, Yellow means, usually one of the indicators isn't great. At risk, one or two of the indicators aren't great. Um, and red means that the COVID is fairly active in that state. Now, the good thing is, if we look at all of these red states down here, these are the states where there's a high caseload. They also correspond, let me change this to caseload. The high caseloads, Louisiana is the highest, 40 and a half out of every 100,000 are testing positive in a given day. So that's a high caseload. They all have infection rates, that's the second column of numbers, that are below 1, except for Georgia. That means that in all of these states, except for Georgia, the infection rate is coming down. So nationally, we're seeing a decline in cases. So the states that are in bad shape are getting better, all right? Now, it will take a little while for that to show up in the positive test rate. As they have fewer cases, the positive test rate should drop and start to get in line with the 5% that the World Health Organization recommends. And the ICU headroom should go down. So right now we can see Florida is in a state of emergency in a bad way. They've used up all of their hospital capacity. It doesn't mean that they're turning people away. It means they're converting hotels or putting in emergency stations in parks or wherever they can find them. They're setting up more beds that aren't in hospitals, or they're converting other parts of the hospital into emergency care. So this does mean, though, that doctors and nurses are strained to the limit. It's not a good situation. New Jersey got close to that back in April, and the amount of overtime and whatnot that doctors and nurses had to put in was really, really stressing them and causing many of them to get sick. So Florida's in bad shape. You can also see that Georgia is in bad shape right now in terms of ICU headroom. But those all the states except for Georgia right now should be getting better. And Florida, you can see, has an infection rate that's a very good 0.85. That means about every week we'll see 15% fewer cases in Florida. So that's a good exponential decay right now for Florida in terms of the caseload. So they should come off of this dire situation of having 100% of their ICU being used. All right, and as the caseload drops, they will also be able to trace a higher percentage of contacts, which will have a positive feedback of lowering the infection rate. So there we are. That's sort of the big picture for the country. If I switch over to our home state of New Jersey, just click on it and look at its stats. Whoops, that's per county. Go back up to the top. Okay, you can see New Jersey has an orange rating for being at risk, but all of the numbers are actually pretty good, with the exception of the infection rate. It's growing a little bit at 1.1. That does mean that every week we would have 10% more cases if we continued on that trajectory. But you can see the ICU headroom is extremely low at 15%. That means 85% of our ICU capacity is available to handle a surge in cases. We probably need to do better with contact tracing though. We would probably want that number to be closer to 80 or 90% in order to be effectively lowering our infection rate by contact tracing. So we're only doing about a half as good a job as we could with lowering the infection rate through contact tracing. So that's an area where New Jersey could improve a lot. Okay. Now it's a little bit of a puzzle as to how New Jersey could have an infection rate that's not good while its ICU headroom stays very low. So what I want to do is talk about immunity, okay, and our resistance to diseases for just a moment to explain why that number might be what it is. So let me stop sharing the screen. So our immune system has a bunch of layers, okay? The top layer is things like our skin, okay? You can't get COVID passing through your skin, all right? So the skin is a protective barrier to preventing diseases and infections from getting in. We all know if we have a cut, we're more likely to get an infection. Our skin is our sort of our first line of protection. We have other first lines of protection as well. Breaks in the skin barrier are like our eyes, okay, and our mouth, our nose. So with COVID, those seem to be the places where it enters our body. That's why wearing the mask is so effective, because it's blocking my mouth and nose, and so I'm not spreading COVID out to anyone else if I happen to be sick and not know it. And it has some impact on protecting you from breathing it in, but it's mainly if everyone is wearing a mask, we're not breathing COVID out for other people to breathe in. So we're catching it in the masks. So masks have proven to be very effective in cutting the infection rate. But the next line is internal. Inside of our bloodstream, we could have antibodies on the white blood cells. So if you have antibodies, as soon as the COVID virus would get into your body, the antibodies will knock it out. So it won't let it take root. Okay, so it's kind of a barrier to entry for the virus. Now, how do people get antibodies? Okay, the first way is, basically you have to have been exposed to COVID-19, and your body will develop antibodies to fight it off. Okay, and then that will prevent COVID-19 from coming back in again. So anyone with the antibodies specifically for COVID-19 must have had COVID-19. So that's where the antibody testing comes in to see who was already sick. All right, and in parts of New York City, they found that the antibody tests returned a rate of about 68% for a working class neighborhood in Brooklyn. So a lot of people had been sick in that particular neighborhood, which is in New York, had a terrible outbreak at the beginning. But antibodies seem to die off over time. Okay, so our immunity through antibodies doesn't stick around forever. Okay, so eventually people who were sick might get sick again. And we don't know what the number for that is. it doesn't seem like we're seeing repeat cases yet. Therefore, the peak for New Jersey was in April. So I do believe that we have at least a 4-month immunity. That's a conservative number. So we'll be working that into the model, that we have about a 4-month immunity to the virus. All right. Now, what happens once your antibodies sort of die down? Okay. It's not that your body, somebody who has previously been exposed to either COVID or something like COVID-19, like another coronavirus, may have developed T cells in their body. Okay. Now, T cells are more like little factories ready to pump out antibodies. They aren't the antibodies, but they're sort of a production cells for the antibodies. So somebody who was previously exposed to a coronavirus might be able to start making antibodies quickly once they get infected. So some of the recent literature that I've read makes it sound like people who are asymptomatic or have very low levels of symptoms possibly were exposed to a different coronavirus. So their body is ready to fight the coronavirus that is present now. So a lot of people seem to be able to fight it off very effectively. In fact, a lot of people don't even know that they're sick. But certainly the people who have been infected by COVID-19 will have these T cells to fight it if they were to be exposed to it in a later round, even after their antibodies die off. I shouldn't say the antibodies die, but as the number of antibodies in their body has dropped to an insignificant level, they would be able to ramp up production again if they were to get reinfected. So they're less likely to get sick badly, and they're far less likely to end up in the hospital, and less likely to end up in the intensive care unit, and less likely to die. So I think we might be at a point in New Jersey. This could explain why the infection rate is going up, but the hospitals are, the rate of hospitalizations are actually going down. We might be starting to get to a second round of infections where people just don't get as sick from it. So that's a hypothesis. And I am going to now rebuild our model, the SEIR model, around that hypothesis. So I want to explain theoretically what that looks like. And then in another video, I'll actually go through more of the mathematics and our computer code for that. So let me pause and do an iPad share. Okay, so here we have our state variables for the SEIR model: susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. But we also added this category D for, it's for fatalities. You've died when you've got, after being infected. Okay, now remember, and what we've been assuming is that the death rate is about 0.25, okay, percent. So about 1/4% of people, 1 in 400 who get sick, end up dying from it. Now this assumes that a large number of people have been sick, and many of them don't even know it. Okay, and that seems to fit our what's happening pretty well. Okay. Now remember that we had coefficients that determine the rate at which susceptible people become exposed. We had an A times I times S determined that. And then we had a coefficient of B that told us how quickly exposed people were becoming infected. Let me actually get rid of the I and the S part of this. And let's just go back to writing in the coefficients that drive the train. And then we had a coefficient of C that told us how quickly infected people would either recover or die from COVID-19. Okay. Now, what this model doesn't yet have is it kind of assumes this is the end. It's a one-way street. And when you've recovered, you're permanently recovered. Obviously, if you've died, you don't recover and don't ever enter back into this, this whole situation. Okay. But what seems to be happening is that we have these people who have recovered might become susceptible again. I'm going to call this S2. So these recovered people may enter back into the susceptible population. And we're going to need another coefficient. Let me just use the coefficient, since we're just going down the alphabet. Let me just make that a D. All right. And so those people have left the pool of being recovered and are susceptible again. Okay. Now, before in our model, we had been just putting them back into S. Okay. But I'm going to create this S2 because these are people who now have the T cells. All right. Some of the people, they're more likely to have the necessary T cells to fight off a reinfection. So they're just as susceptible to getting sick, but the results of getting sick shouldn't be as extreme for them. So because they have those T cells, they can then enter an exposed category, but they're exposed with the T cells, and then they're infected with the T cells. So I'll call that an I2, and then they can go back up to being either recovered or having died. All right, so in my model, I'm still going to use A, B, and C to drive those rates. Okay, but what's going to happen is we're going to have a second death rate here. And the hospitalization rate would be probably somewhat proportional to this. So I lowered this to 0.1% in my model. Okay, so we won't have people dying at the same rate. And we also, that means not as many people go into the hospital. People will be less sick once they go through this. Now, we probably could continue where we actually went down to a layer with an S3. I would assume that if people had been sick twice, they're even less likely to get sick badly if they continue to get exposed. But I'm just going to stop since we're only looking at basically a 2-year scenario. I'm going to only look at 2 layers of this. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. Okay, so that's what the model will look like. The key is that when people are on this lower track, they will be less sick than they were the first time. And in fact, a lot more of them might not even know that they were sick because they now have these T cells that protect them. Okay, so let's see how this plays out. I'm going to, in a later video, show the updates in the code, but I want to show you the results of this code for New Jersey. Okay, and I guess we'll look at Florida as well. So let me pause this, and then I'll show you the model in MATLAB.